I mix what I like, 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 what I like. All right, good morning, everybody. I appreciate you all for joining me and us for this short book presentation on the myth and propaganda of Black buying power, and then hopefully, as long a conversation as you all like. As I put in the chat, please, if you're going to do any social media, and I would encourage you to, obviously, to use hashtag MOBP. Please reach out to your friends even now and invite them to come on through. At the suggestion of Ross, I've reached out to Brother Daruba again. He was just on the Renegade Culture podcast, so I'd encourage you all to check that out. But I'll continue to try to reach out to him. I'm always trying to, catch up with Daruba. So I'll continue to do that and try to get him into this conversation in particular. But if you just want to hear from him in general, I recommend the Renegade Culture podcast, and I'll grab the link a little bit later and put it in the chat if you don't already know where they are. Brother Kamal, Franklin, and Kalanji Chaga down there in Atlanta do actually is one of my favorite podcasts. So, all right. So with that, I'm going to do this quick presentation, relatively quick, and then we'll move on to whatever you all want to say. I hope some of you have at least had a chance to read the book, and others who might join us later have had a chance to read the book and can offer up really any comments, questions, critiques, queries, conundrums, catechisms, cacophony, calumny that they might want. All right. So let's go ahead and let's just start. Let me just start doing that. So I do have a short presentation prepared. And oh, by the way, if folks want, they can either put their comments or questions in the questions or chat. And if you really want, if you're cool with it, I can just invite you on up and you can just be on camera and mic and voice your comments or questions as well. All right, here we go. All right, again, thank you for coming this morning. And obviously, again, the book is The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power. Essentially, what I try to do with the book is go through the origins of the myth itself and try to find where does this concept of buying power come from and how then is it deployed and in what various ways it's used. Where I found that it begins is in the 19th century as a product of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Chamber of Commerce, with the very explicit goal as part of a compendium of studies of cost of living analyses and others to allay the unrest that or reconcile the labor unrest that emerges with increase in capital, capitalist exploitation, and the inequality that exists. So from the very beginning, working people in a very robust labor movement of the time, certainly relative to now, were arguing that, look, we're putting all this work in, we're doing all this, we're producing all this product and wealth, and we're not making enough to actually enjoy in what we're buying. So those in power said, well, we need to figure out a way between the business and political, rather business and economic elite of the day, we need to figure out a way to make sure people are paid enough that they can shop and buy the products that we're making, but obviously not be paid enough to hurt the profit interests of those who own. So one of the ways to do that was to discover, to manage, to study it and say, well, how much is their money being able to buy? And buying power became a concept out of that. Now, it had been referenced earlier, Du Bois, no, I'm sorry, they come a little bit later, but the concept of buying power had been referenced by people in a Black business community before this. But in terms of the concept being sort of concretized and evolved in the form that we're describing, or sort of organized and disseminated in the form that we're describing, this is where I'm arguing, or at least the history shows it started. From there, skipping ahead a little bit, what I end up focusing on the most is the post-Second World War shift broadly in the United States, where propaganda becomes the primary mechanism by which as others have put it, the elite communicate with the rest of us, where the goal was to solidify the United States as a singular economic power in a post-World War II moment, and to use that moment to wed the concepts of citizen to consumer and democracy to capitalism. All of this was done by a very rather covert but explicitly discussed plan by the business elite, the corporate world, and of course the political elite and the intelligence community, all of whom wanted to project an American hegemony and a Western hegemony as being legit and normal. And wanted to argue that if the world followed along with American business, capitalist, so-called democracy, it too could see the levels of strength and power and freedom it was claiming not only to have, but to be projecting and offering to even its poorest and most oppressed citizens. In fact, there was a lot of very interesting developments at that time where there was an argument around turning the factories that had been producing products for war into producing products to be sold to the American consumer. So of course, then you would need a consumer base that could afford them. And then of course you would need an advertising structure that could impose itself to figure out, well, how much are people spending and where are they, and what are they spending it on? And then how can we as advertisers use our ad budgets more specifically in a targeted fashion? So all of this was developing after the Second World War, and into this context steps a Black, not only business class, but a Black commercial media class, most notably, as I talk about, John H. Johnson, who, though I know you can't hear the audio in this piece, it's readily available on YouTube. And this is just the clip where you just see the head of the Chamber of Commerce, Chairman Weeks, using the concept of buying power and announcing that the Negro had $15 million in income, and out of that $1 billion in income rather, and out of that billions could be spent on could be considered buying power that could be targeted by American business. Johnson, of course, wanted to use this concept to collect white corporate ad revenue, to expand his media empire. And it's almost, I didn't write it this way, but it's almost, interesting to think of it in this way, that the buying power that Johnson ends up wanting to promote, as is this video is a product of Johnson's company. The goal to, of course, sell the Negro to white corporations to collect ad revenue. But it's interesting that the buying power that Johnson is promoting as real, this $15 billion, or connected to the $15 billion in income, he knows in a sense doesn't exist, and the wealth that he wants, or at best is itself limited, and the levels of wealth to which he aspires, and that many in the Black business class aspire, can't be achieved by simply targeting the Black community, because Black people don't have that much money. So what he understood, and certainly Black business doesn't have enough money to advertise at the levels that commercial media would want to produce the kinds of incomes that people fantasize about. So to get that, you have to get white advertising dollars. Well, white ad buyers want to believe, at least, that Black people have the money to buy these products. So here comes Johnson saying, not only do we have the money, but also satisfying the broader political wills of the established power structure. Johnson is promoting a Black community that, look, is not wanting to engage in civil rights struggle and human rights struggle and Black liberation, and isn't wanting to raise questions about a capitalist economy, but in fact wants to participate in a capitalist economy. So, of course, going back to the broader mission of the post-World War II era and the construction of a media environment that we're still not caught up to, I think, in understanding, this was perfectly suited to that mission, to, again, project a version of Blackness that was not threatening and that the world could look on and see, if we let America take over, this is how we'll be treated. If the formerly enslaved can aspire to these levels, then certainly anyone else conquered in expanding American empire could do the same. Excuse me. Then I argue the next phase, so to speak, and maybe in many ways, the most important phase, the concretizing of the myth of Black capitalism, of which buying power is a subset. And this is in the Nixon era. The sort of apex of Black power, Black liberation struggle internally, the apex of global anti-imperial struggle internationally, and the use of American targeted propaganda to again remind the so-called Negro not to go in that direction, but to accept the vision and the definition of Black power as defined by Richard Nixon, which is, you see him saying right here in his own administration's ad in support of this fictitious Homer Pitts looking to go to college or into business. A vote for Richard Nixon for president is a vote for a man who wants Homer to have the chance to own his own business. Richard Nixon believes strongly in Black capitalism because Black capitalism is Black power in the best sense of the word. And here again is where the phrase, the term buying power even loses its meaning in terms of Black buying power or buying power even for any group, which is that power as we would conceive it has been redefined into something else. Buying power, or power in the phrase buying power, is a marketing concept, which means power to enrich those who own the economy. Power to buy the products that are being sold in the economy. It's not a power to achieve a kind of independence or sovereignty that many of us think that when we hear that term. And so we've been captured by a marketing phrase. Now, there's more I could talk about and we can discuss in conversation that is occurring in this moment also, whereas I do talk about a little bit in the book, the Black commercial press, the white commercial press is promoting these concepts at a time where a lot of Black activism, including that of Malcolm X, is picking up on that concept and popularly promoting buying power. And other activists and other radicals even across the political spectrum are picking up on the popular phrasing and then trying to adapt it to their political purposes. So again, even just hearkening back to the earliest phases where Booker T. Washington and Du Bois and Marcus Garvey all agreeing at various points in times that this concept is real, we're all attempting to adapt it to their own political purposes. And I'm certainly not arguing that activists and Black commercial businesses and Black conservatives are all, arguing for the same purpose or the same use or ideologically in the same camp even. But I am arguing that what I'm trying to quickly describe here is what has encouraged that all facets of that political spectrum sort of fall into the spell of this presumed pool of money that is sitting there that could be used for a variety of different ways or in a variety of different ways for a variety of different reasons, and to, in some ways, improve the condition of Black people. But but it has been the promotion of that mythology concretized most heavily in the Nixon era, Nixon administration, that have helped to, I think, again, confuse that issue. Again, when buttressed by a Black commercial class that is regurgitating the myths without real discussion or vetting, it encourages a blind spot, and I think in many of our analyses. So again, I'm not making at this point an ideological argument one way or another. I'm simply arguing for a better understanding of how the process works and how, in this case, the concept of buying power has emerged. By the way, if I have to just quickly say that if you ever get a chance, if you haven't already, the OJ Made in America documentary, and I don't often promote commercial documentaries, but is the best commercial media product I've ever seen on the issue of race, class, and media. And their discussion of the OJ Hertz commercials of that time perfectly summarize the point I'm making. I mean, they're very clear that he was being promoted against Black radicals, Black power, Black image is as threatening, and was picked because, as one person said, he was an African, but he didn't have he was an African, called him an African, but with European features, making him much better looking than I guess the regular African. Anyway, it's fascinating stuff. I then move in the book to some discussion of what I'm calling the modern purveyors, with a review of the Selig Center and the Nielsen Group, who working, which is unfortunately one of the more complicated arrangements that I found in researching this book. Nielsen working with the most popular Black commercial media press organizations to actually produce and promote the myth. So as I've grabbed here, quoting from my book, which is actually quoting the report to your right, the multicultural economy from the Selig Center, the $125 report, which I think is intentionally, discouraged from being reviewed. But what they say here, and I'll just quickly read, the reports have become widely respected industry chronicles touted for their exclusive insights, data trends, and perspective that better prepare marketers and brands to connect with this audience segment. By concurrently sharing this report with millions of readers around the country, we have helped to create conscious consumers who are aware now more than ever of how their economic power has a direct impact on the marketplace overall. And forgive me, this quote is from the piece on your left, the Nielsen Group. So Nielsen works with the National Newspaper Publishers Association, NNPA, to produce these studies that claim Black people have this buying power. But when you look at the Nielsen citations and what they're referencing, they're almost just like all other press outlets referencing the Selig Center. And what is the Selig Center? The Selig Center is a center out of the Terry Business College in Georgia, whose goal is to, as they say on their own website, to assist Georgia businesses with reaching their target advertising audiences. So they're not here, and the reports admit they're not here to tell us an accurate situation or condition of Black economics. They're not here to explain the relationship Black people have to the economy. They're only here to create advertising directives to wed corporations with the advertisers, rather corporations and advertisers with their target audience, and in this case, Black people. So as it concludes here, we are proud the combined Nielsen and NNPA resources have galvanized corporations and consumers alike to think and behave differently towards valuing the African-American consumer and their economic impact on the U.S. marketplace. And look, as I talk about a little bit about in the book, this phrase in the first quote, conscious consumer, is not meant in the way that many of us might think. The conscious consumer they're describing is someone who they talk about as a Black consumer who is looking for Black symbolism in the products being marketed to them. They're not talking about Black ownership. They're not talking about redistribution of the wealth that's being generated. They're not talking about Black hiring practices, none of that, or pay, or none of that. They're talking about the conscious consumer is someone who is just looking for that symbolism and will be manipulated by that symbolism. So if you throw some Black faces in your commercials, if you throw some kente cloth on someone in a commercial or around your product, it will have, as they argue, an impact. And they produce very convincing promotional materials to suggest that's the case. But in any case, whether it's impactful or not, the point is it is not buying power, as is often conceived, in part because very few people actually read these press reports or the statements or the reports themselves. Very few people vet the research that goes into these reports. And as I argue in the book and show, I think very well in the book, or clearly in the book, there are no methods. There is no economic method that is based in substance that supports these numbers. As the Selig Center reports call it themselves, the buying power numbers are what they call, quote, estimates and projections. So, and based on, as I go through in the book, methods that have nothing to do with what real economists use to assess the actual condition of groups of people. One of the other problems, and perhaps the biggest problem, is the role that the Black commercial press plays in this to collect that white ad revenue. And as is often the case with me personally, people are often saying to me, why don't you go on Roland Martin's show and talk about this? He's got such a big Black audience and a popular show. But what I'm arguing is that the commercial Black press that he is part of, and this is in this instance, not necessarily a critique, but just to show where the role and interests are. The goal is to collect, as I have here on the left, part of that what is ultimately, approaching really $500 billion in total ad revenue spending, but here just $163 billion spent in ad revenue every year by just the top 200 ad buyers, assuring that historic arguments regarding corporate influence over media content framing and bias remain silent. So, as I just show here, when you just scroll down at the bottom of Roland Martin's front page of his unfiltered website, he has what I'm arguing is the point, that he's trying to let corporate advertisers know that he has this strong Black audience, and if they fund him, if they give him corporate advertising, he will help them, as I'm quoting from his page here, the ability to reach what Nielsen, as he quotes here, the $1.3 trillion in spending power. Now, again, he's not vetting the Nielsen data, which is just literally quoting without detail the Selig Center's reports, and they're certainly not vetting the Selig Center reports for the veracity of their claims. And as I talk about in the book, my attempts to do that have not been successful, because I think there's really nothing there supporting it. One of the other problems that I think we're facing right now is the myth is symbol and propaganda. So something that I do talk about in the book, and unfortunately we couldn't publish these pictures in the book as I would have liked to due to copyright. And as you can see why it makes sense, because part of my book does critique Black banking and the claims associated with buying power and as its promotion. And then here, when it's linked up with the Black Lives Matter movement as sort of a progressive challenge, it just reaffirms the myth. Now, the claims, as I talk a little bit about in the book, that Black Lives Matter was using money in the card to get people bailed out and doing some good with them, with the relationship with One United Bank, a Black-owned bank that was promoting investing in their bank and getting this debit card, and this being part of Black buying power. And in the book, we can talk more in the conversation maybe, but I do have a short section on Black banking and what the bank, that mythology is related. But here, I'm only really just trying to point out how the myth is promoted. So regardless of whether or not we agree or disagree about the good being done with this project or this program, what I'm saying is, since buying power is itself a myth, and trying to show in terms of propaganda how it's generated and disseminated, this becomes an important point, because it's promoted in part as and one point I didn't mention this morning is that buying power is advertising rather model is applied to all manner of groups. I mean, everything, any kind of group and municipality you can think of, but it's only sort of weaponized against Black people, and in this such a way that using the iconography of struggle, of Black power, of Kemet, of Africa, it suggests that buying power and banking and depositing collectively generated funds into privately owned banks is somehow an advance for the collective. It's as I would argue, illogical, but but whether we agree on that, the myth itself is being disseminated, propagated in part in this way. And I do think and equate it to a psychological warfare tactic in terms of its application. And as Marshall McLuhan, I think, argued correctly, advertising is a vast military operation. One other point very quickly, I am mindful of the time, and I will be wrapped up in 5 minutes so we can engage the conversation. Gross domestic product and GDP is associated with this myth is one of the most pernicious and misunderstood elements. We're constantly being told that Black GDP is the equivalent of any number of different nations. Black buying power is the equivalent to the gross domestic product of any other number, nations, and making Black people economically as strong as anybody else in the world. Blah blah blah. But what this misunderstands, among many other things, is what gross domestic product really is, which is just a measurement of the value of all the goods and services bought and provided in a given year in a given location. It's the value of what goes to those who own the economy. It is not a projection of what is actually distributed throughout the economy. And gross domestic product is never used by honest economists to assess the actual economic condition of people within an economy, because it does not measure inequality. It is also, there's other things that I mentioned in the book, is also misleading, that it suggests that Black people control Black people control buying power, the buying power of the community, in the way a federal government or a private equity group might have the ability to manage the funds it is in control over. And that's just, again, not an adequate understanding of that reality. So as I argue in the book, what we should be focused on is the real use of gross domestic, or the real definition of GDP, and what that number is as it relates to the United States. Whereas at the time I was writing the book, at the end of last year, that number was put at $21.5 trillion, meaning all of the money, all of the wealth created by all of us buying and spending and shopping and paying our bills. All of that we're doing is generating $21 trillion every year in this country. The question is, how is that distributed? Who ends up with it? And as I'm arguing, that's a matter of public policy, and we would be better spent focusing on that and saying we need to have that redistributed better, instead of making arguments about buying power and what we are or are not doing. Because as I'm ultimately arguing, one of the most pernicious elements of the myth is that it blames us for being poor, and it blames Black people for a sort of financial illiteracy as having anything to do with the kind of inequality that we continue to suffer. And that's just, again, pure fantasy and imposed mythology. So as I said, I am stopping there. I will encourage you to please sign up and follow me at imixwhatilike.org, and not just me, but a lot of the collective great work that gets published there. And at I Mix What I Like, and to continue the conversation. And with that, I will stop sharing and come back to you all here. And let's see, we have some questions here. I'm wondering if the folks here, Chris Marshall, my man, always welcome. I don't know. Do you want to come on screen and ask the question yourself? Does anybody else? If anybody else wants to do that, please just let me know, and I can go ahead. Hakeem Muhammad was up first with a question I promised to answer from the other day. Hakeem, if you're here, you can say something in the chat, and I'll bring you up if you would like. But he's asking here if I'm familiar with Richard Wolff and my opinion of cooperative, of workers' cooperatives as an alternative to capitalism. I am familiar with Richard Wolff. For those who don't know, he's a professor emeritus of economics somewhere in the Northeastern University. I can't remember, escapes me, but I believe he's in New York. He does a regular podcast. I follow it online on YouTube. Actually, I think it's Democracy at Work or something like that. Socialist economist. I think produces a lot of valuable analysis. I don't know that, I'm not sure if you're saying this, but I want to be clear that I don't think he's arguing that cooperatives or workers' cooperatives are alternatives to capitalism. I've always understood that these are sort of I always think of it in terms of the Panthers, survival programs. These are steps, positive steps towards a break from capitalism as an economic and social order. But as it relates to this particular conversation, I'm often asked about, what about Black cooperatives and that kind of work. And so one, I just want to be very clear. I advocate pretty much all manner of political and economic struggles. So if I'm not saying we should not do cooperatives. I'm not saying we should not buy Black and bank Black. We should do all of those things. I'm only arguing that these are not pathways to revolution, and that they're not pathways to overturning the economic condition of the collective. So in small pockets, in small settings, in certain areas, I think cooperatives could be evolved. I think collectives can be developed that are helpful. But in terms of the so-called Black national whole, I don't see how that again, wealth isn't generated and redistributed through economic collaboratives and it's political power. So if we really want to see whether it's Black businesses do better or Black workers do better or anyone in the economy do better, this is a matter of public policy. We have to get involved at that level. It can't be about trying to redistribute the small pockets of money that we do have. And that's why I keep wanting to talk about the gross domestic product of the United States. If we have, again, this is maybe political fantasy, but why not? If we have a platform, a policy that redistributes the GDP, that is, whatever wealth is being created, instead of it going to the handfuls that own the economy and then hide it from tax paying and don't pay taxes and all that kind of stuff, it's just built in that it's redistributed in some kind of way, then it really doesn't, it almost then becomes less important what group is owning what business, because let's even just say that the small corner store in your neighborhood is owned by someone else. The wealth it creates is going to get redistributed back to you anyway in my fantasy public policy plan. So and by the way, that does not disincentivize people from developing business and innovation. It disincentivizes people or public policy being generated to only allow one group to do it and to benefit from it. So again, the people that run the corner store in whatever neighborhood we're in are there because of public policy, not because they're smarter economically, not because they're pooling their wealth. It's because they're getting federal government support from either their home country or the United States or both. So, Chris, I don't know if you're there right now. If you wanted to come up on your own, I don't see, again, say something in the chat, but your questions here. What's your position on Wolf's real wage in connection with the myth of Black buying power? Is there a Black response to Richard Wolf's real wage? If I understand the question, what I've understood Richard Wolf to be saying about real wages is that they've stayed flat since the 1970s. That is, that the working person has been producing more in terms of product to be sold since the 1970s, but has not been paid more in terms of what those salaries can actually buy in the economy, which is what real wage is. So to close that gap, we've been offered credit so that we go into debt, and the average Black household is $6,000 in credit card debt. Last I checked, it's probably worse now and going to get worse. So in fact, I think Wolf himself has said this, but others have said that if real wages were to be adjusted so that we were back to where the working person was in 1970, we would have a minimum wage of, I think, at least $23 an hour. So even that $15 minimum wage fight is woefully low. Now, again, as it relates to this argument, or sort of a Black response to it, it doesn't change much if the public policy doesn't as I'm arguing, redistribute the wealth that we're all creating back to people, and an increase. Even if we got to where we were, working people were in 1970 with real wages, what does that mean in terms of the Black relationship to the economy, Black wealth, redistribution of that wealth, redistribution of the wealth for non-Black people in the country? It doesn't really mean as much as I would like it to mean. It just means getting back to where we were in 1970. And if that is the goal for a revolution, which I'm not saying that's Richard Wolff's, but if that's the goal of a revolution, we're in real trouble. Chris is also asking, how do we collect Black economic data based on Black economic realities that can be used to create strategies and tactics based on that accurate economic data? Now, here is where this is actually sort of an implicit argument I'm making in the book, that the data on Black economic reality is actually, relatively speaking, everywhere. It is not even disputed. The beauty of, and I do recognize it as beautiful, even as I hate it, the beauty of the propaganda system and the sophisticated nature of it in this country is that even with us awash in real numbers and data, the messaging, the delivery of the messaging, and then the interpretation of the messaging is so well managed. So, for instance, I think in terms of mass incarceration and my critique of Ava DuVernay's 13th Netflix documentary, it's not that she's offering new information or false information on the state of Black incarceration and policing and all of that. It's the interpretation of the data. Although there was critiques of some of those arguments too, but my argument is more of the interpretation of the data that becomes the problem. Having Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and so-called liberals offer up the analysis, that's the problem. So the problem is we don't hear the Black radical analysis of the economic data. We hear the data discussed in very narrow contexts, often in commercial media or with well-funded pundits or academics even who have, put it best, just different politics than certainly I and I think you and many others would have. So I think that's always the biggest problem. So what I think I show in the book is that here is all this information coming out about the real condition of Black communities in this country or Black people in this country. But then as I try to, in certain instances, match it up with certainly the Black commercial press discussion of the time and the discussion of buying power at the time, and their worlds apart. And that's what I think becomes the bigger problem. And then, as you and I know, there are certain, online efforts, so-called movements that take information that we all could see as, readily agreeable and then run in very, I think, conservative and scandalous directions with it. Craig Bardo, I appreciate you. And again, if you let me know if any of you want to come on and it I really didn't mean for, I didn't just want it doesn't have to be just me. And I do have my coffee and my veggie chips. Craig asks, how does European, so I hope you all, maybe that's why you're not coming on, because you got your, nice plates of food. I hope you got something nice, How does European class analysis fall short of addressing our circumstances? Are universal programs sufficient? That's always a good question. One of the reasons why I've always liked to run with internal colonialism theory is that I at least used to hope that was the most synthesizing analysis to bring so-called Black materialists and nationalists or cultural nationalists into some better agreement. And that's why a lot of different camps grab Fanon and Malcolm and others and go in different directions. But because to me, it was a synthesis of the Marxist class analysis, but with the African-centered colonial experience, which has cultural and spiritual and other elements to it that don't. What's up, Head Rock? What's up, Hetty? I appreciate you coming through, man. that doesn't, encompass all of the experiences of colonized people. So to me, for Fanon's critique or back and forth with Marx, in the pages of his work, that to me is where it's at. So, and I certainly think Black America or Black communities or African communities need a class analysis. And my book is again implicitly making that argument that the Black commercial media class is, just by its interests and its class, and some could argue anti-Black, if you want to put it in that context, agreement with white corporate and political elite. The end result, I would argue, is ultimately the same. And so we do need that class analysis. But look, I love reading Marx, and I think I talk to people, my friends, all the time. Not enough the African-centered community reads. I think they just dismiss materialists, and clearly materialists are not reading African-centered work in the breadth that it includes, and they get essentialized in these arguments as well. So I love to read Marx. I think reading Marx and Engels and Lenin and them and Mao, I think that's essential. And Black radicals, they're the ones that taught me to do that. But it can't be, I think, all that we study, and it's obviously insufficient in terms of dealing with the specific conditions of African people. So what I've come to just say is, look, broadly speaking, we do need multiracial, multi-ethnic, international, solidarist efforts that are class focused, at least. And then once we take care of a certain thing, certain levels of crises, each community will then have to deal with how it's going to finally heal itself on its own and on its own standards, by its own, So in this case, in terms of my argument here, let's just get if we can redistribute the GDP of the United States so that we would maybe not have any poor people and no homeless people and no hungry people and no people without health care or quality education or good food to eat. And we would probably have less war and less police violence. Like, a redistribution of that GDP would I think do a lot. Would it do everything? No. And after that, African communities, Latinx communities, whoever communities have to come together on their own terms and figure out how do we go to the next level of healing? Because there's hundreds and more years of pain to get over. So oh, my bad, Chris. Come on, here, Chris. Come on and respond to anything. I just saw this. I'm sorry, I was looking in the chat for this. Come on, yeah, I'm sure. Come on to the screen and did you get the invitation? And feel free to respond or add to anything that I didn't get to in your question. But that should have worked, right? Just give you 1 second. Okay. Priscilla, thank you very much. Appreciate you coming through. Can we count on the state or its policy change for significant changes towards the path of revolution? Do you believe public policy can ever be redistributive to the point that it wouldn't matter which group is producing, consuming? Can the racial colonial state ever change its economic policy to redistribute GDP to the eternally colonized to the point that it wouldn't matter who's? I appreciate you directing to my specific argument those questions. Look, what I do believe is that the only real power we have is our political and social collective movement power. We don't have the economic power that is claimed in the myth of buying power. So to the extent that I do believe that any of this is possible, those are the directions I think we have to go in. That's I think where we need to center the fight. And then, as I might put it, other contradictions might become clear, which might require other responses from us. But my base argument is that we cannot keep going back to the myth that we can just pool our resources and redistribute our resources amongst ourselves and circulate our dollar, all those kinds of things. That is not going to help. It just continues the myth that we are creating our own inequality through through financial illiteracy and being backwards and buying rims and weed and all of that, when we should be doing better with our money. When in reality, that's not how wealth is created. We have to remember, we're seeing it right now. In fact, I appreciate you all taking a break with me this morning from what we're seeing right now, to the extent that we can take a break. That the military violence, and Malcolm X was right, the police do locally what the military does internationally. The militarized violence we're seeing right now is largely in response, is exposing itself as here to protect business, property, and the state. So behind white American wealth has always been a militarized, state-sponsored, imperial colonial takeover. So the idea that we are being told to be more financially literate as a pathway to catch up is pure fantasy. That to me is and what I was trying to show in the book is it's intentionally constructed a fantasy to distract us from the political struggles that we should be involved in and the fights that we need to be more involved in, to prevent us from doing what young people are doing right now. That if what was happening in the streets right now were more organized along the lines of Kwame Ture and was sustained and had maybe was in preparation, in greater preparation and connected to other agenda items and political struggles, this is what they're fearing. And this is why the police are out here all over the country abusing the people, even the white ones that are out there. Because anyway, so I'm going longer than I meant to on this question, but my point is that this is why we are being encouraged to focus on what little money we do have, as opposed to the political struggle that we should be engaged in, because it's public policy that determines not only how wealth is created, but who gets it. So again, if any of that is to occur, the direction of my argument and the questions you raise is where I think we need to be expending our energies. And yeah, that's right. Hetty is right. They have to be vigilant to protect what they stole. I mean, this is what the police are, this is exactly what the police are here to do. And as the song that DJ U-Rock produced years ago for Hetty, that I had the pleasure of being invited on, that Tarzan track. I mean, that's the point. The police are here to protect property. And since, as the Panthers said, we were property, that relationship still remains. So, I don't know, Chris, if you're ready. I guess you would just have to accept the invitation. I'm not sure if or if anybody else has any questions or responses or critiques. I would love to hear it. If not, you can also just let me know, and we can wrap up a little early if you all want. But I certainly don't want to shut off the conversation. But I also just don't want to be rambling on aimlessly. And Priscilla, if I didn't address your questions well enough, or if you have a follow-up, please, please do. Oh no, I hit the wrong one. Craig, my bad, Craig. I was inviting you. I apologize. I meant to be inviting Chris. So let's see. I should just be able to invite you from here. Yeah, Chris is accepting and connecting. Sorry about that, Craig. I didn't mean to keep. I know you might have been like, man, I said no, dude. Propaganda does work. By the way, I mean, I do try to address this in the book, but increasingly, I admit, as a professional in terms of my own private personal study and work, propaganda has become more and more important. In fact, I've joined some folks, the Organization for Propaganda Studies. We're trying to organize a roundtable now to deal with some things happening in the world on this, but propaganda is the extent to which those in power put their efforts and their money and their resources to developing public messaging, or strategic communication, as they now call it, in almost in a militarized and academic sense. We can't underestimate that. Chris Rossi still says accepted and connecting. I'm not sure. Michael, any ideas on how we marshal the collective to influence public policy given the current political status, polarization, even within the Black community? I appreciate that question, and I'm not entirely sure. I think not starting with myself, not enough of us are vibrant members of an organized political organization, and so I think that's the first problem. And we are given so much messaging, including from Black punditry and academics, that encourages us back to sort of very acceptable patterns of behavior. So we're almost exclusively, particularly right now, being encouraged to go right back to vote for Joe Biden as the momentary single solution to our problems. So it's very hard to find room for these. One of the reasons why I appreciate almost, the flip side of this COVID moment and all this virtual conversation is that I knew this would be the case, but in advance, but trying to reach an audience with an argument for this book has always been difficult. For 10 years, it's been complicated and difficult. And even now with the book out, people are not, for a variety of reasons, and media outlets in particular, not anxious to have this conversation. Because its core argument encourages a reassessment of our relationship, not only to our media, but our to political apparatus. And so penetrating this media environment to get these questions or critiques or arguments into the public sphere of the Black public sphere is very complicated, very difficult. I have not been able to do much with that. So I would like to, I don't know. I would like, all I can really fall back on is I hope more people will fold this kind of argument into their political work and have it expand in their networks. The critique of buying power, the argument over public policy, and to raise more questions about, we just celebrated Malcolm X's birthday a couple of weeks ago, and his argument about how we address electoral politics, I think, has never been developed. And in fact, many people spend a lot of time misinterpreting and mispresenting his arguments around the vote. But what he was arguing was not that we vote for the lesser of evils and the better Democrat every 4 years, but that we involve ourselves in electoral politics at a grassroots level in an organized fashion, promoting and running our own candidates with our own platforms, with our own agenda, and on and on and on. So I don't know, that would be one strategy I'd like to see us do more. Not wait to see which one they're going to tell us to vote for, but put our own candidates up there. And if they don't get accepted or run, then we do something else with the vote. That's one thing. But even with the critique of voting for Democrats, that argument is very hard to have, particularly, and again, a very funded media environment with a lot of Black punditry and media being presented as Black, but funded by very white and even conservative white sources, or in a context of very conservative white advertising, revenue chasing, which, without even being told, people self-censor and say, look, I know I can't have that conversation if I want to get some of that money. So, Michael Young, what has been the function of Black celebrities? So, Michael, I hope that helped, and please feel free to follow up if I didn't get to any of that well enough. Michael Young, I appreciate your question. And Chris, I don't know what's going on, man. Am I doing something wrong? It just says accepted and connected. Please say something in the chat or somewhere. Let me know if I'm missing something. Michael Young, what has been the function of Black celebrity throughout this, whether it's T.I., Killer Mike, or other Black celebrities making statements about the protest? Well, in the book, I talk about Jay-Z, T.I., Killer Mike, and other celebrities, Beyonce, some other Black rappers a little bit, and their relationship is as commercial product for the most part. And when it comes to the buying power concept, I talk a little bit about how Killer Mike on one end of the political spectrum does the same thing that Jay-Z does on the other end of the political spectrum, relatively speaking, and promote the buying power myth. So Killer Mike did the same thing the other day. as did the sister mayor of Atlanta. Their comments around the protest focused on the behavior of the protesters and focused on, including specifically a focus on protecting the businesses and the business class. And, you know, and honestly, when I heard Sister Tamika Mallory give that very powerful speech in Minneapolis about, you know, where is Target and AutoZone and all of this, the same thing I would say to Black businesses. You know, I thought the same thing about Atlanta. You know, at some point, the Black community has to have that conversation. What good does having a few Black businesses or a whole bunch of Black businesses and Black politicians do for the community? As I show in the book, the numbers nationally are very clear. It doesn't mean much because economically, Black people in terms of wealth and income disparities are as bad off as ever. We're obviously in the streets again today, literally right now, because the conditions, materially speaking, for Black people nationally have not improved. So I'm not advocating looting or burning anything up. I'm just simply saying if people are doing that, the color of the business, the Blackness of the business, I don't know is as relevant. So when they come out and speak, that's the message that they are offering. And when Killer Mike and T.I. were giving their going on their, you know, sort of, I don't know if they're still doing it, their sort of economic political touring. I've tried to reach out to them directly through people we know in common. I got word just the other day that Killer Mike had agreed to read my book and come on, and at some point I hope he does, because my disagreements here are not hostile. It's just that I think that the myth has been promoted in such a way that it has made it almost, if not impossible, very difficult for people to get over some of them. So they get regurgitated very easily for applause lines, and they're invited into spaces like commercial media and political events to advocate. Because then again, the concern of police violence is redirected, just as we saw happening in Baltimore. And again, I said then, after the Freddie Gray killing, that it was a very slick media trick, helped by Black punditry and leadership, to redirect the media messaging from the violence of the police to the so-called violence of the protesters. And we're seeing the exact same thing happening again. And even as there is some violence, it's always around, is it so-called outside agitators? Is it justified? And is it distracting from the killing of Brother Floyd, et cetera, and so forth? And I'm left always to wonder, how in the world is anything a protester doing detracting from the killing of Brother Floyd more than the killing of Brother Floyd and the killers of Brother Floyd and the institutions that support and promote it? So I don't know. Priscilla, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And you know, I hope everything is better in Rio. And I appreciate you joining from down there. Chris, let's see. One appeared on screen. Let's see. I just accepted and connected. I'm sorry, man. I am really not understanding why it's not happening. Let me I'm gonna try one more again. Christopher Marshall, yes. Invite on screen. Reprompt. The way I understood it before, it just happened. The person just showed up once I did that. This is not. I hope you're using Chrome, by the way, as a browser. That might be the issue.
There you go.
There he is.
There it is.
All right, man. Again, I'm sorry we couldn't get your video run during the book launch, but I'm here now. OmniAfrican.com. I was just watching you and Sister China. Was that yesterday? Talking about Mama Marimba.
Oh yeah. We were talking about what's it called? Let the Circle Be Unbroken. Yeah. And basically the study guide for Yurugu.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's I was enjoying it. So please go ahead and elaborate some more, or respond to something that I heard there.
So I guess kind of my question was, like, I saw and I've seen you mention the George Jackson quote where he talks about buying power, and then I've also seen where A-Trap Brown talks about, even I think it's on page 140 of Die Nigger Die, and he talks about how even if hold on, let me go right to it. He says he's basically talking about how they this country operates on an annual budget of $800 billion. And I guess my question is more so like, you know, I mean, like you said, there's been enough analysis and there's enough, you know, data, but like, how do we get through, you know, the propaganda and where even just the revolutionary people understand the proper data to kind of work off of? Because a lot of people, like you've shown in your book, have gotten stuck on buying power, and I'm wondering if it's like absence of people researching stuff properly, or is it just malicious? Because I guess kind of what I'm seeing is, even with the cultural nationalist Black Panther kind of schism, is that a lot of the propaganda is moving people more conservative, is moving people to be more conservative in terms of like economics. So I kind of feel like if maybe we're able to consolidate the revolutionary, you know, economic analysis to where people have something more concrete to work off of.
Now, again, I appreciate, you know, again, the only thing that I really don't know how to penetrate the message, you know, this is something that I've been trying to do, you know, my whole adult life pretty much, but and without, you know, great levels of success, admittedly. So the reason that I've always been an advocate of that philosophy of emancipatory journalism, and again, shout out to Hemant Shaw for coming up with that or coining it, is that the core tenet of it is that people engaged in anti-colonial struggle have to be organized and be and part of that effort has to be producing their own media and journalism. Mm-hmm. Now, it has to be, you know, sort of professionally done in the sense that it has to be researched and honest, of course, but it should get rid of claims of unbiased or non-biased and be overtly biased in favor of those organized efforts for liberation. The problem I see now is that too many of us are doing our good work in disparate, atomized spaces where only a handful poke through every once in a while, and it's not in a sustained way, in any way that I think is meaningful enough to overcome the dominance of mainstream media. So there are obviously pockets of underground and alternative presses and media production and YouTube and all kinds of stuff happening. I just don't think it's organized enough in enough way to get a big enough public sphere in the Black community to have enough of an impact. So I keep trying to find ways to collectivize that work to bring us all into, but it's hard to do. And especially in this world where everybody's it's almost by design encouraged for all of us to have our own channels and pages and this and that it where we may be arguing in similar ways. I think it doesn't bring enough people to the table at the same time to have discussions, debates, or get on the same enough page, especially when we're all going right back to, you know, NBC and CNN and, you know, some big Black commercial outlet, whatever our favorite ones are. So I really don't know. And the real, of course, issue is that we're not organized politically enough and radically enough in general. So I really don't know. And that's something I'm stuck on. How do we? Because again, that's why the word propaganda is in the title of the book, and that's why the book is more focused on that than anything economic, because the economics are really simple. Black people don't even earn barely $800 billion a year. How can we be spending $1 trillion, and then how can that be power? I mean, it's that simple. So everything else is just in the messaging. And if we have, so I say this, you know, it's been interesting, man, and then I'll stop on this question here. But since this book has come out, on the one hand, I'm recognizing that a lot of media, can't engage. But at the other hand, I have to also acknowledge that for me, at least, I've had more sort of commercial or bigger media attention really than ever. And what I've learned in that is that a lot of really popular Black media has sort of grown up around me that I didn't even know about, and I'm supposed to be studying this stuff.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of the shows, in fact, a lot of the shows that I've been invited on lately, I've never even heard of before, but they have huge audiences and have been around for years. So that's in many ways my bad. But the point that I'm getting at is that those are commercial spaces with, in many ways, commercial ranges of political conversation that have a penetration that is making it even more difficult for those of us doing this kind of work in our spaces to have the kind of impact. So as we're building up all of our, it's the same thing, and I really will stop here. It's the same thing I used to argue about generally national media. Like if you go back and read some of what the white communication scholars were saying in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they're talking about while the world is in anti-colonial struggle, they're developing supranational entities and organizations and mechanisms to say basically, fine, you can have your little nationalisms, you can have your country and your flag, because we're going to orchestrate not only economic supranational entities like the World Bank and IMF and all of that, but they're going to develop mechanisms of communication that will make, as Huey Newton said in the 70s, the boundaries, geographic boundaries, irrelevant, because everybody's message can penetrate a geographic boundary. So I say all that to say the same thing is happening in a media sense on a micro level in this country. We're all running around developing our radical outlets, and some of them are relatively popular, but around that is emerging a very commercial and more penetrative apparatus that is making. So I really don't know, man. I really don't know.
I mean, I guess a big thing is just even trying to break, because Huey Newton talked about how once the media, and I think Edward, and I think it's a crazy connection between Edward Bernays and even like I said, Huey Newton, to where that media changed. Because what's wild is when Nkrumah talked about what happened after World War II, and kind of how you talk about it in your book, where empire started after World War II. Everything kind of changed, but I kind of feel like even with the argument of a revolutionary nationalism and propaganda, I kind of feel like a lot of people are stuck in a time capsule, because when Huey Newton came with intercommunalism and talked about what happened with the media, like on the propaganda end of it, there's been we haven't gone past the 1971 even to talk going back to George Jackson. So I kind of feel like a lot of us have to be more educated on that propaganda aspect, because what I've talked about on my boycottforgiveness.com is The Family, right, on Netflix. They've made it where and I briefly talked about it on the video that I sent you, but they've wedded capitalism, Christianity, and democracy. So even with a lot of what people don't like with a lot of the anti-gay laws, a lot of that came from Doug Cole. So they keep adding more layers to stuff, and I kind of feel like we need to first catch up with the Huey Newton and read Edward Bernays and get hip to George Jackson. But I kind of feel like a lot of people are stuck in this time capsule where it's not really conducive for people having media literacy, let alone financial literacy, to be able to push stuff forward. Because I just feel like a lot of stuff is becoming cosplay to a point where people want to say, okay, I want to get stuck in, because I think even on your on the launch party, like you talked about how people weren't reading other people's work, and that's true, and I kind of feel like when you look at where stuff got stuck at, you understand why these beefs continue to exist, because people, I think in a lot of ways, have gotten lazy to where they don't want to push stuff forward, so they rather just get stuck on word salad and repeat stuff over and over, even though a lot of stuff has become obsolete. So I kind of feel like there's something that has to happen where there has to be more new research, not only to learn what has already been done, but to push stuff forward, because in a lot of ways, we've regressed, so I just kind of feel like that propaganda piece, we really got to get into it to clarify a lot.
So again, Chris, I appreciate you. I'm gonna let you go and get to other questions real quick.
Appreciate it.
I appreciate you, man. Thank you very much. And I want to say again, the work that he and China Fox do at Omni African and just in their YouTube stuff is really important. And it's actually nice to see a collaborative effort between a loving couple do it too. It's kind of dope. The one thing that at least in my approach with this book, I want to say it that way, that I think it's important. I wouldn't want to say, I'm going to, at least for now, I want to hold on the term lazy and give folks a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, only to say that, it's not just that we stopped analytically with Huey and George and Asada and those of the 70s or whatever. It's that those movements were wiped out. We have to acknowledge it by the most powerful military and police force in the history of the world, through the counterintelligence program, through its continued iterations today, which are all perfectly legal, by the way, after the Patriot Act. So, as David Gilbert, the white political prisoner, has brought up, and I think quite rightly, that it's not just that people got locked up or killed; it's that the scientific element of the struggle was wiped out. So a lot of analysis has been I read that George Jackson was right about the issue of buying power because I read George Jackson, not because he's encouraged as part of the literature even of Black History Month. It's because coming up through radical organization that I was introduced and encouraged to read George, and even made to read George. So we have to, I think, be on some level appreciative of that fact, that as much as I disagree with almost all of these folks on the issue of buying power and many other things, I'm aware that they're responding to a context that is created intentionally, that is powerful, and designed to do it. And when you look at the way buying power is constantly regurgitated, and I in the book talk about some of the numbers in terms of its constant repetition in the atmosphere, and then never mind all the times that I know we hear it in activist meetings and in churches or mosques or wherever we go. We just hear it regurgitated without a documentation or recording. It's so penetrative that it's almost impossible to discount. So what ends up happening is that people again just use it, try to adapt it. But anyway, so I just want to give us a little bit of room and try to remember that we do have to do the hard work of rebuilding and reconnecting some things and doing some study and doing some reading, and creating media in an underliterate world that will try to pick up some of that slack. But it's not. The book is short. And I think in many ways, the argument can be made quite clear about buying power, but the solutions are really, really not. And as I argue in the book, it's not just that our media environment and press environment is captured, but our public policy environment has been captured by those against whom we, I think, have to struggle some more. Brian Lazinski, I appreciate you coming and having me on your program a couple weeks ago. Can you say more about Du Bois's analysis of Black buying power? It seems odd, given his understanding of political economy, that he would fall into mythology. Was this pro-Black buying power interpretation earlier in his life? Very good question. And this is where some things get a little bit, for me, uncomfortable, because it makes me have to wade into the slight waters of a slight critique of the late great Amos Wilson, who I think has done so much great work, but in this area has helped promote the myth and help promote a misunderstanding of Du Bois's misunderstanding. And again, look, even as I'm saying it now, look, I understand how crazy it sounds and must look for me to be saying that these people got anything wrong about anything. So look, I admit I have some arrogance and some ego, particularly around this particular topic. but I'm extremely uncomfortable with this area of the critique. But anyway, when you read Amos Wilson's Blueprint, so first, as I said before, the myth has been so popularly promoted and disseminated and misunderstood by so many for so long that so many have adapted it or tried to adapt it to their various purposes. So in the 19th century, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, there are Black business leaders, even pre-Booker T, who were saying, we have this buying power, we just need Black people to spend their money with us. There are radicals who emerge later, like Du Bois and Garvey, who say, not in a business sense, spend your money with us, but who are saying we can develop collectives, as Du Bois was arguing, or as Garvey was arguing, we could use that money for Black business, but in such a political way that it creates opportunity and revolution for the collective, if I can quickly summarize it that way. So in other words, even as I would argue, Garvey, took a sort of Black business or even capitalist line at times, it was not in the way that certainly, even John Johnson or Bob Johnson later, no relation, or, some, or Oprah or somebody like that would be advocating a Black business or, or something like that. I'm just saying that. Du Bois earlier in his life. So Amos Wilson, the reason I'm bringing him up in this is because he talks about in his argument in favor of buying power, and Amos Wilson is one of the first and more prominent African world radicals to bring the Selig Center. He literally brings the Selig Center report into that book without critique, and in his speeches without critique, and says that the Selig Center has provided us with the evidence that we have the buying power, and then we just need to do it differently. So he talks positively about Du Bois's method described in Dusk Till Dawn, the 1930s, I believe, mid-30s autobiography, where Du Bois talks about his approach to the collective economics, about redistributing the money in the Black community to Black businesses that would redistribute to the Black community, that would help the Black community expand, et cetera, in a very sort of Frederick Douglass, Freedman's Bank kind of way. But as Douglass learned before and Du Bois would learn later, this can't work because Black people just don't have money. Black people don't have access to the public policy that would protect their interests in terms of tariffs and trade and interest rates. They didn't have the political power to protect themselves militarily or police-wise, obviously, as we saw with Tulsa and other places. And there's no money in the Black community to evolve Black business and Black banks to a big enough size with a big enough reach to go back into the Black community and redistribute the wealth that they're creating through investment or et cetera to help the collective as a whole. By the way, with all the money in the world, there's all this white poverty out there too. So even white banks, the richest white banks, can't do it for white folks. So the idea that a Black version of that could do it for all of Black people, I think the contradictions are self-evident. But no, but by the end of his life, then the substance, and this would be my critique of Wilson's use of Du Bois in this instance, writing a blueprint in the what is it, 95, 96, that Du Bois lived another 30 years after that argument was developed and took a very different position, whether you agree with it or not. He had moved on from it. So I would have thought that at least Wilson should have dealt with that, even if it was to dismiss and to say that Du Bois went farther left and lost his mind. I think he should have done more to show how Du Bois's own analysis moved to a point where he said, I have to even leave the country because we can't institute any form of socialism here. And, anyway, so anyway, I don't get to develop this that much in the book, but that's as fast a version of that as I can I can get to. Now, it's interesting that I see Ross talking about, and I saw some of this, that Karen Hunter, who had me on her show on Sirius XM, and she's one of them. I admitted to her I had never listened to her show. I had a great time. Thought she was very nice. The sister she's co-hosted with was, I thought, fire starter. Was a great time. But I did see recently that she was both one promoting the Malcolm X Netflix documentary, which I did reach out and say, there's some critiques there too, but that I did see she was going back on Twitter to some of the supporting Black business and buying power stuff. And I end the book talking a little bit about some scholars call continued influence effect, and basically the idea that people, if even when confronted with evidence that contradicts a previous report, if that new evidence contradicts underlying political or philosophical assumptions, people will reject it. So she said on the show during the interview, Karen did, that she hadn't finished, finished the book, and she was struggling with some of the claims in terms of the numbers that I was arguing, and admittedly was uncomfortable. And I get it, and that's part of what I'm arguing is the challenge that the myth presents. That it is uncomfortable to argue that we can't just buy and spend our way to freedom or equality or even improvement for that matter. And that other more complicated, difficult, and even risky, dangerous actions would have to be developed. I get it. I'm not saying I'm thrilled to have reached that conclusion. It's just the other conclusions I find are not supported by any evidence. Chris said the Garveys forget how much ideological diversity exists even under the umbrella from Carlos Cooks to John Henrik Clark and Krumah, Nnamdi Ezekwe. Sure, a lot of differences in those ideologies, for sure. Anybody else? We've got a little bit of time, although we don't have to take it all. Folks don't want to. I would encourage people to not only read the book, but to invite others to not, I obviously want people to read it, but to engage the argument and reach out and invite the discussion into other spaces and discussion, debate, etc. I have no problem with any of that. Please hashtag MOBP. And people can follow me at I Mix What I Like, of course, and we can most assuredly do others of these, do some more of these, get other folks involved. If folks couldn't make it today and see this in a replay, feel free to hit me up, and I'm always happy to do some more of these or do them in different formations with different folks and the like. So what's the connection between your work and E. Franklin Frazier's Black Bourgeoisie? I mean, I use his word. I mean, I think that, well, the obvious connection is the critique of the Black business class and media elite that want to promote, I heard it in Killer Mike, and I keep forgetting her name, forgive me, the assistant mayor of Atlanta's comments the other night, that as Frazier said to something, and I think I quoted, or I know he says, I don't remember if I quoted or not in the book, but something to the effect that they exist in some sort of fantasy. Peace, Craig. Thank you, man. That there's a fantasy that the bourgeoisie, Black bourgeoisie, create and promote because they benefit from it. And so of course people would want to come out and discourage the destruction of a community or a society that is maybe destroying them, but somehow creating space for this Black bourgeoisie to do quite well. At the same time, I think it's perfectly logical. You take a group of people, abuse them incessantly for hundreds of years, doesn't even take that long. But there is always going to be a segment that's going to say, look, man, we got to find our way out of this, and to the extent that I can do well and enjoy some of the fruits of this, I'm going to do it. And if that means I have to take certain political positions, I'll do it. So that's what I'm seeing, you know, and that would be the connection or a connection that I am critical of that Black commercial media class and bourgeoisie that doesn't evolve itself as I would understand political activists and critical thinkers should, but then avail themselves and are availed on, upon us by, their political or economic sponsors to give us an analysis of the moment. So on the one hand, it's easy to say don't burn down a neighborhood, but on the other hand, if it's emanating from a position of because there's a class interest in protecting an apparatus that is abusing the people doing the burning, well, that should be brought out and discussed. And it's incessantly promoted as something that is pro-Black and radical and truly concerned with the community. And I think it's at least more complicated than that. So, Hey, brother Chris, and everybody, I appreciate you. Obviously this is fun and something I'm very much interested in and happy to keep going. I don't want to. Okay, hold on a second. I don't see a name here, but I got a question. What? Oh, is that 1212? Is that the same 1212 from the launch? What's up, 1212? Please talk more about the cognitive research that suggests people will stay stuck in their attitudinal belief systems. Does that research suggest that those predisposed towards anti-Blackness will not substantively change their attitudes when presented with the benefits of acting in a shared class anti-capital stance? Ooh. If not, what conditions are required? Should all people be required to submit to a psychedelic empathic conversion prior to engaging in feigned empathy? I tell you right now, I don't know. I don't even know if I know what that is. No, I think I have some concept, but no, I don't know. It seems like the white movement of alleged allies have only moved once their lives have been disaffected by the coronavirus. Well, it's similar to what I remember people saying about Occupy Wall Street, that white folks didn't want to get involved until all of a sudden they found themselves as part of that 99%. After the last economic crisis, and I would certainly argue that history in this country is at minimum suggestive of the fact that even white liberals and the left have to be pushed to more radical conclusions as it relates to the Black community, and as a group have not. Certainly, individuals in small pockets have. I mentioned David Gilbert. I mean, I think any white man that's, spends, is locked up for the rest of his life because in the 1980s, he, supported or was alleged to have supported some more radical elements of the Black liberation struggle. I think he certainly deserves to be counted among that, but he's not indicative of the white community. So I don't know, but to that first part, the research that I reference doesn't speak at all that I can remember to anything specific to race or white supremacy. It's specifically about journalism and media and communication and the impact of that communication on various audiences. But the research was primarily saying, and specifically about if people read stories that are misreported and then there is a printed retraction by that press outlet saying we got it wrong and we're sorry. Even then, if that apology would require the reader to change his or her predisposed or pre-existing beliefs, they'll reject the retraction. So the point I'm making in the book is that in terms of buying power, not only is there not a retraction and an apology from the press, there is simple regurgitation and repromotion of the myth, making it that much less likely that my argument is as good or bad as it may be, is going to struggle. In terms of white attitudes towards Black people, I don't think we need that study to reach any conclusions. And much has been written and said about this historically. And even Dr. King, for all the references he's getting lately, is ignored as having said at the end of his life that white people had not, as he said, prepared themselves psychologically to overcome their own racism. They haven't done that. So, but again, my argument has never been we have to change white attitudes, by the way. And this is why I'm kind of, this is why, again, it didn't really come up today, but this is why I'm critical of the move for reparations, because it requires too much of a change of people's attitudes. That is less, so tactically, one of the reasons why I'm arguing for approaching GDP is because I'm not saying Black people don't deserve reparations. I'm saying that tactically appealing to white conscience and logic is not going to get it. So I think the greater appeal, with potentially an even greater material reward, is to go after that GDP and redistribute that for everybody. To say, you don't have to make it about specific reparations for me and my community. Everybody gets repaired if we redistribute GDP, and then the Black community can, on its own, independently, with all the resources it would need, can start to figure out the rest of that repair. Because obviously the spiritual, cultural, and other forms of repair aren't going to come from any monetary gain, and white people can't deliver that anyway, even if they wanted to. So I don't know about. So no, the research doesn't talk about the predisposition to anti-Blackness. It indirectly, and through my own interpretation, admittedly, that research is simply saying that even when white people are presented with obvious evidence that Black people are not inferior, white people will collectively not move to address those structures. So again, it's even in terms of alliance, it's admitted. I get what risks are being taken out there today, but it's far simpler to align for an action or an event in the streets than it is for a protracted political struggle that would require extended effort over time. So even as Christopher Marshall tweeted out today earlier, Malcolm X statement on rebellion, where he talked about demonstrations are cool, but they have to demonstrate until they end what is being demonstrated against. And too often, certainly in my generation, we go out, we make noise, and we go home. And any of us living around DC over the last 30 or 40 years have seen so many versions of that. Now, what I'm seeing today looks admittedly different and hopefully different. But for so long, we see a couple of days of rah-rah, and then everybody more or less goes home, and we're back to that same disorganized, captured media and political environment. Anyway, so I hope on some level I've addressed some of that. 1212. Admittedly, I submit to psychedelic. So first of all, nobody's going to submit to psychedelic empathic conversion. Nobody's going to submit to anything. That's why I keep saying the only power we have is organized political social movement power, which through sheer overpowering will, so to speak, would impose a new world without going through, can we develop some empathy? I can't imagine that. Anyway, I don't find that fruitful, but I maybe I can learn more about that for sure. CB McGinnis, thank you for your question. So then in your analysis, the collective as a whole has been riding on the wrong info about buying power, where in the real conversation, if I'm hearing you right, the real conversation should be how we work from here to build real wealth through political repositioning and economic repositioning, or do you have another position in mind? That's more or less it. And not necessarily for the purpose of building wealth, but for the purpose of redistributing the wealth we've already helped to create. I tell this story all the time because I think it's funny. Maybe a year or so ago, I was in the Dick's Sporting Goods with my daughter buying a soccer ball and some other equipment. Maybe this is 2 years ago now. I can't remember. And we get up to the register, and the guy, rings up the thing. It comes. I remember the bill was like $80 some, and he says, "Would you like to donate to cancer research?" And I said no. And he gave me this, he gave me this kind of look, and the people in line behind me kind of, you felt this vibe of shame. And I said, but, and I said, well, wait a minute now, why? I said, I just contributed $80 to a multi-billion-dollar operation. The owner of Dick's Sporting Goods is a multi-billionaire. Why am I asked to give any more money to cancer research? I've already contributed through my shopping. Again, my consumption, this is why I was joking. I mean it though. We should have a hashtag respect my consumption, whatever, because not only did my consumption support industries that maybe shouldn't be supported in terms of the mass production of these goods and the negative labor impact, but just in general, let's just say, take that aside for a second, supported the people who made the product, supported the person working behind the register to have his job, certainly supports all the other managers and intermediate administrative staff. And then obviously it supports the owner and the board of directors, etc. Why then should I be asked and made to feel shame for not giving more when I've already given so much? The question then should be, if Dick's is really concerned about cancer research, redistribute those billions of dollars that I and all the other consumers of your store have already contributed to. That's really my point. So in other words, we shouldn't be shaming people for buying fronts and earrings and hair and weed and whatever else we're buying. We should be encouraging more of it, at least in the intermediate stage, before we really overturn or reform an economy around some other way of generating wealth that's maybe going to save a planet that's apparently already too late to save if Michael Moore's now banned movie is correct. But in this context, consumption should be more valued. We should be praised for it, not punished and shamed for it. It's just that the wealth that it generates should be redistributed so that nobody has a potholed road or an insufficient job or no health care or a bad living quarters or food to eat or water to drink. That's sort of what that's what I'm trying to argue here and advocate for. This incessant focus on a mythological amount of money we don't have. With the suggestion that if we stop shopping, we can somehow improve our collective condition, totally misunderstands how the economy works, and in fact ends up hurting the people that, imagine, it doesn't matter to me anymore, but imagine if you tell everybody just, don't spend all that money at the barber shop, don't spend that money at the beauty salon. Well, where does the barber and the beautician go? Where do the people who run the barber academies and beautician academies go? Where do the people go who make all the products that get used? In other words, the trickle down of what we're seeing right now with the COVID, with people not able to go shopping, the reason the rich are telling us to go out and hurry up and get back out there at whoever's risk be damned, is because they see that without our consumption, everything collapses. The only issue is they get to keep all the money. 12 again, would the public policy not change? Would the public policy not changes require a change to political behavior, which research suggests require attitudinal shift? If I understand your question, the attitudinal shift is in how we address ourselves to the political system. That if all we're going to do is show up every 4 years and be browbeaten into voting for a warmongering, accused sexual predator, we're not advancing. So I would think that we need to be saying, look, we're going to run these candidates, we're going to support these candidates, and at least one tenet of their platform is we're going to redistribute the wealth that's generated in this country. We're going to find whatever public policy needs to enact to do it. And if whoever business doesn't like it, whatever corporation doesn't like that, they're going to have to lose some of that money at the top, so be it. The threat should be reversed. Take your company somewhere else and see how you do without the consumer base of the United States. That would be, I would think, the better way of doing it. You also say Tyrone Powers' Eyes to My Soul documented that the FBI study suggested protests would last 6 months at most then subside. I remember Tyrone Powers' work, and I have seen similar studies about protest and preparations for it and the acceptance of it. And we've seen some of the fusion center development over the last few years, allowing Homeland Security and other agencies to work with the local police to manage uprise and protest. The point being, because those who study economies, honestly, also study their impact. And as we start to close this presentation, we can go back perfectly to where I started with the rise of the buying power concept coming from the business and political elite wanting to manage public opinion and the social unrest, which they knew was coming and was going to get worse as a result of the inherent tensions between capital and labor. And we are in the hyperist moment of that right now. So this is why, of course, we're seeing more, the elite have already talked more about the increased role of propaganda and public relations and warfare, the increased role of advertising in our media environment, including in the news. Again, people just saw exposed the other day that the Amazon commercial that was passed off to local news companies all around the country, having local news reporters presenting something as news, but was really an Amazon campaign using literally the same script. So much of our environment is being constructed by the very people who, in their own analyses, develop programs and processes and response agendas for the inequality that is coming. In my book, I talk about, even before this crisis, there was already existing venture capitalist and elite concerns around the devolving buying power, first of all, just of Black people. They were already saying Black people's inequality economically in the United States is getting to a point where their buying power is even going to drop to the point, is going to suffer to the point where, even before this crisis, they were predicting a 4 to 6% in the total drop in the total GDP of this country because Black people were no longer being paid enough to go shopping. The point being, the elite were already saying, we are oppressing Black people too much to exploit them at the levels that we need to expand our business and our projections into the future. Nick Hanauer, my favorite that I reference in the book, a venture capitalist, was saying, I don't want socialism or anything else. I'm a venture capitalist billionaire who benefits the most from this system. But even I'm saying, if we don't pay working people more money so that, as he put it, a Starbucks employee can actually afford to buy a Starbucks coffee, they will come for us, as again he said, with pitchforks and knives. So as a self-preservation tactic, the elite were already saying we have to redistribute some of our wealth a little bit. Even Nick Hanauer was saying the corporate elite have to stop with the nonsense that paying working people more would devalue their company and hurt their stock. Even he said that was nonsense. So the point is, it almost feels like, and I understand there's a certain self-created myopia doing this research, but it almost feels like we're the only ones believing this nonsense at this point. Even rich venture capitalists are saying we're not paying Black people enough. They don't have any buying power, and that their lack of buying power is hurting us, because that's what buying power is, the ability to enrich them. So we need to get caught up. And that's why I wanted to help try to puncture this myth, because I don't claim I have any solutions or the solution. As someone who spent a lot of my adult life as members or attempted to be members of activist organization, I'm very clear that we need collectives to be built to not only generate the human power to overcome these situations, but to develop the collective analyses and solutions that are required for all of this. So, yeah. Okay. Anyway, got the 15-minute warning from Crowdcast. Look again, everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time. Obviously, nobody has to do this. There are many other things going on in the world that are at least this interesting. So I appreciate it. And please do again, share this. We'll share the video when it comes out. And yeah, anyway, just let's keep it going. We'll certainly be doing some more things here, some new collectives emerging. So stick around and stay tuned. There's a lot of stuff happening. So anyway, as I always say at the end of these things, like Fred Hampton said, to USA peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. And thanks again. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.